This presentation integrates open source data from the Institute for the Study of War's recent report, The Libyan Revolution, and leverages the Palantir analytic platform to examine relational, geospatial, and temporal elements of the strategic landscape moving forward. Our assessment showcases the tribal dynamics and regional fractures within the rebel forces and the NTC, Libya's National Transitional Council, which will have significant implications for Libya's long-term stability. In February 2011, major demonstrations erupted in Libya against the regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi amid a wave of popular protests sweeping the Middle East and North Africa. Regime security forces led a brutal crackdown on protesters and sparked an armed resistance throughout the eastern half of the country and several cities in the west. This rebellion unfolded into a broader conflict when Gaddafi ordered a full-scale offensive against rebel-held areas. As the violence escalated, the United States and its principal European allies denounced Gaddafi, sanctioned his regime, and called for his removal from power. Libya has traditionally been divided into three distinct regions: Cyrenaica in the east, Tripolitania in the northwest, and the largely uninhabited Fezzan in the southwest. Historical enmity between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, dominated by their respective capital cities of Benghazi and Tripoli, has grown stronger since independence in 1951, as both regions have struggled for control of national leadership. Adding a presentation layer shows the population density of Libya. More than 90% of Libya's 6 million citizens live along the northern coast. There are about 140 tribes in Libya, but only 30 tribes or so carry significant political influence. Of the Arab tribes, the largest is the Warfala, which is concentrated in Tripolitania and historically allied with Gaddafi. The other, the Obeidi, are the largest tribe territorially and numerically in Cyrenaica. Several Obeidi members served in important military posts under Gaddafi and later became senior rebel military leaders, including Abdel Fattah Yunus, Gaddafi's former interior minister and later the top rebel general. The event of the Arab Spring that led to the revolution in Libya can be pulled from the Object Explorer, a tool for top-down analysis of large data sets. Creating a temporal filter in the Timeline Helper allows us to spotlight critical events. On December 17, 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia in protest of poor economic conditions, prompting the spread of uprisings throughout Morocco, Egypt, and Yemen. In Libya, demonstrators held a day of rage on February 17, 2011 in Benghazi, calling for Gaddafi to step down. The next day, regime security forces fired on citizens from the rooftop of the Katiba military barracks during a funeral procession in Benghazi. Using the selection helper to open media associated with the event, we can see that on February 20th, the Benghazi rebel group breached the wall of the Katiba and successfully expelled Gaddafi's forces. 2 days later, on February 22nd, Gaddafi's interior minister, Abdel Fattah Yunus, defected along with his Special Forces unit. Yunus quickly became an important rebel leader in Cyrenaica. His defection, along with several others, marked a major turning point in the early stage of the rebellion. While the rebels worked to consolidate their control in the east, Gaddafi mobilized his security forces against the rebellion, drawing on his tribal allies throughout Tripolitania and Fezzan. The opposition movement in eastern Libya worked quickly to develop basic political leadership. On February 26th, former Libyan Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil announced that a transitional government had been formed. This council, known as the NTC, was made up of former regime officials and educated Libyan expatriates, as well as representatives from city councils in Cyrenaica and rebel-held cities in the west. Coloring objects with the presentation tool to identify important trends, we can use the histogram helper to highlight the 20 of the 48 NTC members who remain undisclosed. Also, 18 of the 48 members of the council are Gaddafi defectors. Rebel forces and the NTC faced a robust and entrenched regime structure loyal to Gaddafi. Using one of Palantir's collaborative tools, a shared graph shows the structure of Gaddafi's military forces and reveals the way in which he relies on the brigades led by his sons Mutassim and Khamis. Both men handpicked their fighters directly from the Warfala, Kadadfa, and Makarha tribes in Tripolitania and the Fezzan. The shared graph can also depict the flow of NATO resources to the rebels. In a matter of 4 weeks, from February 17th to March 19th, the United States and Europe reversed a decade of efforts aimed at normalizing political, commercial, and military ties with Gaddafi, and they launched a military campaign against him. The debate to take military action against Gaddafi intensified as the rebels' position on the ground deteriorated by mid-March. At that time, loyalist forces were driving the rebels back towards the rebel capital at Benghazi. If Gaddafi reclaimed the city, there would have hardly been an opposition for the United States and Europe to support. After extensive diplomatic efforts to garner broader international support, the UN passed Resolution 1973 on March 17th. This authorized a no-fly zone and the use of all necessary means to protect civilians under the threat of attack. Following a UN resolution, a Paris summit was convened on March 19th to craft the coalition's political and military agenda. At the conclusion of the summit, the participants made a joint declaration to enforce UNSCAR 1973 with all necessary actions, including military force. That day, the United States and its allies launched Operation Odyssey Dawn. Shortly after the airstrikes commenced, President Barack Obama, French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and British Prime Minister David Cameron reached a tentative agreement that NATO would take over the operation. But political obstacles soon surfaced within NATO, as many in the alliance were reluctant to shoulder the mission. Again, concerted diplomatic efforts were required to place the military campaign under NATO's command. Operation Unified Protector began in earnest on March 31st, after NATO assumed command of all coalition military actions in Libya from the United States. The transition was fully completed a few days later on April 4th. Adding a custom-built presentation layer to the map, you can see the area of operation for Unified Protector. This includes the no-fly zone and arms embargo. Creating a polygon search of Libya, the heat map helper shows the concentration of NATO's sustained bombing campaign from March to July. NATO and rebel efforts successfully stalled Gaddafi's offensive in the east. As you can see, airstrikes focused largely on Gaddafi's strongholds in western Libya and on Misrata, a significant rebel enclave in the west. The uprising in Misrata threatened Gaddafi's hold over Tripolitania. Therefore, loyalist forces launched a determined effort to recapture the city and contain the rebellion in the east. By viewing the major infrastructure within a radius search of Misrata and creating a filter of rebel assaults on loyalist forces, you can see how initial fighting was centered on the Misrata airport. Ultimately, the regime concentrated its forces near the city and launched an offensive in late March that marked the start of the second phase of the battle. Over the next 2 months, rebels and loyalists entrenched themselves throughout the city and fought street by street for control. Dwindling arms and ammunition raised the possibility that the rebels would eventually fall to loyalist attacks. This prompted the rebels to bypass the loyalist siege in late March by beginning a sea lift of military and humanitarian supplies from Benghazi to the port of Misrata. This proved pivotal to turning the tide of the battle. We can use a polygon search to show how NATO played an important role in facilitating the sea lift. This allowed the rebels to markedly expand their fighting numbers and combat power. In late April, ongoing NATO airstrikes and rebel gains in the Misrata city center forced the regime to rethink its strategy. By mid-May, the rebels regained control of the city and the regime withdrew from the area, ending the months-long siege. After the rebel breakout from Misrata in May and June, there appeared to be growing discord between the NTC and the Misrata Military Council. On July 20th, the Misrata Military Council held an independently organized meeting with French President Nicolas Sarkozy in Paris. By dragging it to the graph and using a custom search around, you can see all of the entities associated with this event. NTC members were notably absent, suggesting that factions of the rebel forces were operating independent of a central authority. During the meeting, the council proposed a rebel-led assault on Tripoli from the east and west. The offensive from Misrata was to be conducted in coordination with the rebels in the Nafusa Mountains. The 5-month conflict reached a dramatic climax in late August, when rebel forces launched an offensive into Tripoli and surrounding towns. The key to the assault was the progress made by the Nafusa rebels in the prior weeks. The rebel seizure of Bir al-Ghanam on August 6th allowed the Nafusa fighters to move north and attack Zawiya. This city, just 30 miles from the capital, was home to the last oil refinery under regime control and sat astride a highway over which supplies moved from Tunisia into Tripoli. After fierce fighting in NATO airstrikes, Zawiya fell to the rebels on August 20th, the same day rebel fighters launched their assault on Tripoli. By the end of August, rebel forces controlled most of the Libyan capital. The last layer depicts the current status of forces in Libya. After the fall of Tripoli, loyalist forces fell back on three main strongholds: Bani Walid, Sirte, and Sebha. As of early October, Gaddafi is thought to be hiding in the desert area along the Algerian border, and rebel forces continue to fight for control of Sirte and Bani Walid. Even as military operations in Libya near conclusion, the outcome of the Libyan revolution is far from certain. ISW's Libya research team continues to analyze the situation in Libya utilizing Palantir's dynamic platform. To learn more about the Institute for the Study of War and to download our reports, please visit us at www.understandingwar.org.